Chiong present for us for our LTIF project, Transforming Learning and Teaching with Practical Analytics. Chris is a senior lecturer in the School of Business, IT and Logistics. His research interest involves the application of computational techniques to address issues in various domains such as business and education, and his more recent research investigates how to improve student outcomes through the use of technology, including analytics and persuasive systems. So we met Chris at the start of the year when we were sharing our different LTIF projects, and we were really taken back by his software that he's created, the TTM, and in particular we were really taken by his use of analytics into the system and how he tries to get students to become more aware of their own learning and to increase student engagement. So, thanks, Chris.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for the opportunity for presenting, and thank you for attending. I guess a little bit of history, I suppose, very short history. So the guys from DSC, the Practical Analytics guys, have their analytics project, and from the College of Business, we also received LTIF funding for an analytics project. So we're looking at it more from sort of the student level and moving up. So because us being teachers, educators, looking at it from the sort of bottom-up type of approach. So our project was really centered about improving learning experiences for students by getting them to understand their own learning processes. We thought that was fundamental for them to understand their own learning processes so they can improve themselves. That presents a more scalable, sustainable solution. It's something that they will need later on in their further studies or future careers. So there's a variety of people on the LTIF project. Friends is here. There's also a number of research assistants that we've taken on board, and there's also Justin there, who's our research assistant, but is also our PhD student. So the aim of the project was to use analytics as a reflective tool rather than prediction. So a lot of people, when you start talking about analytics, I think by default they go towards prediction, and that's not what we wanted to do. So we wanted to help students understand their own learning processes by self-reflecting. And self-reflecting can be one of those very difficult things. I mean, it's very difficult to go to a person and self-reflect on how you perform. You need something to start the discussion. And that's what we wanted to use analytics for. So we wanted to capture students and how the students were using learning resources and so forth, and how they were performing, how they were progressing. So capture that in some sort of evidence-based artifact and present that back to students so they can reflect on their own behaviour and link that to their performance. So learning analytics, I suppose most people are familiar with the term. It's one of those very popular terms at the moment. It seems to mean a lot of things. People use analytics as a synonym for analysis these days, I've noticed. So that's sort of how popular it's gotten. So one working definition that we found is it's the collection, analysis, reporting of data associated with student learning behaviour. Some of the issues around analytics is that it produces a lot of data, and then it becomes hard for individuals. So in this instance, in terms of learning analytics, academics and students to know which are relevant. So one way to get around that is to use something called learning design. So learning design describes a sequence of learning tasks, resources and supports that a teacher will construct for students. So it really captures the pedagogical intent of a unit of study. There's different terms for this concept, but three common elements across all of these terms are that there's a set of resources for students to access. So these are things like files, diagrams, multimedia and so forth. There are tasks for students to complete, so these are the learning activities that will help students learn something. And then there's support mechanisms that instructors or peers offer. So feedback on assessments, moderation of discussion, helping in the context of information systems, say, helping students troubleshoot what's going on with the program, those type of things. So you can visualize it as a diagram like this. So you've got the task in the middle, and feeding into the task that the learning or the resources that the students require to complete the task, and also the support that teachers or peer will provide. And there's also a sequencing, so normally when they complete a task, they move on to the next task, and that's just the same. So there's resources and supports for that also. So you can use learning analytics to inform the interpretation of outcomes from learning design. So in those circumstances, there are really two types of learning analytics that are relevant. Checkpoint analytics and process analytics. So checkpoint analytics captures data about students accessing relevant resources in the learning design. So these are things like have they logged in, have they downloaded files, have they signed up for some collaborative assignment. And again, I think this is by default what people think about when you talk about learning analytics. So people that have a very negative view, I suppose, of learning analytics. People will often ask me, well, Johnny signed in, logged in 3 times this week, what does it mean? That's not very useful. The thing about analytics is you need sort of big data, and one of the things about big data is a variety of data, so a variety of data sources. Just knowing how many times somebody logged in is not going to tell you much apart from how many times they logged in. So when you mix that with other data, then you can try to find more meaningful insights. But checkpoint analytics may provide some indicators about student engagement, but they're not going to provide insight about the actual learning process. Process analytics is what looks directly into this learning information processing and knowledge application. So what are the students learning, what are their processes? So this is looking directly within the task. So some examples of this could be a social network analysis of student discussions on online discussion boards. So you can look at things like content analysis to determine students' level of understanding. Of course, this is much more difficult than simple checkpoint analytics. So if you bring back this diagram of learning design, you can see that checkpoint analytics fits in with over the resources, and process analytics is more related to the task. So that's just some background information. Now we get down to what did we actually do. What we wanted to do was to get students to use bite-sized learning, so give them something small to learn, and we wanted them to use a very short and repetitive cycle. So they were to perform a task, take a test to understand how well they understood the task, and monitor their progress, and go around in cycles. So task, test, monitor, us being unimaginative, that's what we decided to name our system, TTM. So, I think this is a nice little idea, but it's not very scalable. So students can do that, but it's hard to test students individually and give them feedback whenever they need it. So with our technology background, we went off to build a tool that would do this for us. That's the great thing about technology. You can get it to do things that you don't want to do. So we built a system to facilitate this task, test, monitor cycle. So we saw it as a platform for flexible delivery of learning services. It provides students with feedback that's immediate and both formative and summative. And it provides academics with feedback on how individual students are progressing, and also the entire cohort, so your tute or your course learning. So some of the fundamental features of the system. Excuse me. When you log in as a student, there's a number of courses that are in the system that you're enrolled in. Once you select on a course, you'll get a screen like this. So you can see that there are your weekly topics. Each weekly topic is broken down into a series of tasks for students to complete for a given week. And usually each task has an associated test. So the logic that we had is the students would do a task and then do the test to self-evaluate their understanding of the task. The task is available as a downloadable PDF. You can see that we have bite-sized learning, so we'll give them an indication of how long it will take to do this task. So but we try to keep that to a small amount. Sorry, this should say resource. So we provide them with some resources here. In some examples, we point them towards online tutorials, videos, and so forth, or you could have your traditional course materials in there. And there's also some indication of sequencing or scaffolding. So what are the prerequisites before you do this task? Usually it's some other task. And what can you do after you do this task? Usually it's some other task. The test we provide as a PDF, which they can choose to download, save, print. That's just something for them to sort of sit and mull over. It's not sort of a quick action type of thing where you respond to things very quickly. And in terms of the test submission, they get a duplication of the question and the answer options. So it's fairly straightforward. 5 multiple choice questions, answer the question, hit submit, and that goes into the system. So when they submit the test, they get a feedback screen like this. So it shows them the answers that they've submitted. It shows them whether the answer is incorrect or correct. And they get feedback for each answer option. So I suppose one of the interesting bit is that when they select an incorrect answer, they get feedback as to why the answer is incorrect. It doesn't tell them what the correct answer is. So then there's value for the students to retake the test. So they can retake these tests as many times as they want, whenever they want. When the answer is correct, again, the feedback explains why the answer is correct. Because this is multiple choice, they may have been just guessing or getting the test. And they get also some summative information about how well they've done on that test. You can see up here that this is attempt number 2, and you can access all previous submissions. So every single submission that they make is recorded in the system, and they can access that. So those are the crux of the system in terms of functionality. The other important parts, students can see their performance, and that's done through a number of visualizations. So this is the progress graph. It'll show them the last 5 recent attempts that they've had. So these students had 7 attempts, and these are the last 5 attempts. So they can see their progress, their attempt numbers, they see their score, and they can also access other tests in the system. So this is test 1.1, they can access tests 1.3 and 1.4. We also show them how they perform across all the weeks in the semester. So these are the topic numbers or week numbers. These are the score, the aggregated score for each week. And they can, this is the overview, and they can click down to individual week numbers to get the breakdown on that week. So if they click on one of the week numbers, they'll get a graph like this, which shows them their highest result to date for each test for that particular week. So this is week 1. These are the different test numbers, the scores, and they can go down to all the other weeks. At a higher level, we give them an indication of how they're progressing throughout all the courses in which they're enrolled on the TTM system. So this is a nice overview type of snapshot. And we also give them these percentiles graph that shows how they're performing relative to the rest of the class. So if you look at this second graph here, this is me as an individual student. I haven't completed a lot of the tests, so I've got 3.8%. And if I go across, I'll be in the 10th percentile, which is normally you'd want to be up there. And it has, these social comparison graphs have some motivating effects for the students. So in terms of how do we put all this together, TTM, learning design, learning analytics. If you cast your mind back to this diagram of learning analytics and learning design, how does that fit with TTM? Well, TTM really, in terms of resources, provides the task file itself and the resources provided as part of the task. So from the system, we can run checkpoint analytics on that, so to work out when students have been accessing these task files. That's logged into the system. In terms of process analytics, The process is to carry out the task, and the test is a proxy to how well they carried out the task. So this is what we're using as process analytics. So their performance over time on the test shows us how they're engaging with the process. So with this, you can get a number of interesting things. So you can get some insights into their learning behaviour. So through the log of the systems, you can see the interactions between the students and DTM, get some usage patterns, and from that you can potentially work out some behavioural patterns. So we can do this at an aggregated level, so to work out what's happening with the entire cohort, or you can go down to an individual level to work out what's happening with an individual student. So in terms of results, we've carried out a number of studies with this, and these are sort of some of the more recent ones. So one of the things that we wanted to understand was student study behaviour. So this analysis was based purely on the test submissions in the TTM system. So these tests were non-assessable self-tests. So students didn't have to do these tests. Right? So they chose to do the tests. So we wanted to see when they chose to do the tests. With an assessment, it's fairly straightforward because students are forced to do the assessment, typically by the deadline. So this was an open system, and we wanted to see how they engage with the learning activities. So we looked at the data in 3 information systems courses that we run. One of them was a transaction system. This is where students build sort of rudimentary transactional type of systems. The other one was a web-based system, and the other one was the development of mobile systems. So in total, we had about 30 students that volunteered the data from the system for us to analyse. That didn't turn out too well. It's okay. You don't need to see the dots. You need to see the pattern. So the colourful graph on your left here, there's a blue line that goes across, and these are the lines when tests should be submitted. So all the tests for week 1, we assume should be submitted in week 1. All the tests for week 2 submitted in week 2. The blue dots here are the tests that were submitted within that week. So that's what we're calling on time. And all the red dots are the tests that were submitted late. So not within that week. The tests that were submitted late are interesting. There are 2 types, right? So there are tests that were submitted late because that's the first time the student did it and they did it after that week. Or they're late because the students have carried out that test before but wanted to use it for revision. So in fact, if you look over here, this whole line of red, these are test submissions that students made around week 14. So I'm guessing the exam was around week 15. So what we did then, we made a second graph. So this graph here with the stars, and these are only the initial test submissions. So the first submission for a student for a test. Unfortunately, you can see that there's not much of a difference between these stars and the red dots. So many of the tests were actually late. So this is for the second course, and again, it's got the same pattern. What's interesting to note is that you do get some blue dots here, which are on-time submissions, but after about week 4 or 5, they disappear. So some students are keeping up to date, but it's not sustained. So if you look at the previous graph, again, it's similar. It goes up to about week 5, and then it drops off. So week 4, week 5 seems to be that magic period where things sort of tend to drop off. This is the third course. This course is a little bit different because there's no exam. So there's no burst of revision there. So in general, whether you're looking at all the test submissions or only the first test submissions, you can see that the majority of tests are submitted late, so 77%, 87, 85. So these are on first test submission. If you're looking at all the test submissions, the figures are similar, 83%, 92%, 85%. So that's an interesting pattern that we've picked up. So we always, well, I guess as the course coordinator, I always like to think that students are keeping up, but it doesn't seem to happen. Also, if you look at these graphs, students tend to work in bursts, so they don't work consistently every week. they might not do much for 2 weeks and then have a burst where they catch up. So given that from the data we can get some idea about their behavioural patterns, we wanted to get the actual perspectives. So we ran a focus group, and from that we identified some themes around the tests, the tasks, self-reflection, analytics and so forth, and devised a survey questionnaire. And that was completed by 55 students. And then beyond that, there were about 7 students that were interviewed further to get more in-depth details. So in terms of the survey demographics, this gives you an idea. So this is only the data for information systems students. We do have a class that run in the social sciences, but we haven't incorporated the data yet. But the demographics will show you that this reflects our information students' cohort. So they were largely male, largely local students. The majority were studying full-time, and most of them were between 18 to 21. So in terms of how much did they use TTM, 41% said they used it between 1 to 2 times a week, and 33% between 3 to 4 times a week. I suppose on a number of these graphs, I think what stands out the most for me are the negatives, a very small amount of negatives. So only 6% said they didn't use it regularly. And about 1/5 used it more than 5 times a week. So it was being used, but how useful was it? 58% found that it was very useful, 40% somewhat useful, and again, only a very small amount said it wasn't useful at all, which I suppose gives me a little bit of validation of the person who wrote the task. In terms of how frequently they completed the task, again, a high number of them did it most of the time, 35% some of the time, 20% all of the time, and no one said never. Although I probably question that a little bit. I'm sure there's somebody that didn't do anything. So from the interview, students, the theme that came across was that students found value in the task. Some of them said that they were actually useful. They found issues with time management. So towards the beginning of the semester, I was doing them non-stop. But around mid-semester, I found out my workload from other subjects increased. This meant I was submitting the task less. So that gives some explanation around that magical week 4, week 5, where students didn't keep up anymore. So they stopped working, some of them stopped working consistently and started sort of doing things in batch. So now looking at the test, so we asked them when did they do the test. The majority of them, 37%, said they took the test regularly after the tube. The next highest amount of students said they did the tests when they were catching up on their studies, so working in that burst mode again. 18% took the tests regularly at first, but then stopped. So again, this is probably related to that week 4, week 5 phenomenon that we've observed. And 16% said they regularly took the test before the tube, which probably sort of setting up this, designing the system and setting up this, I wanted to see a higher amount of. So it seems that students don't tend to do, according to this, a lot of preparation. In the 2 courses that I ran, the first task was read the lecture notes and do these tests and do it before you tube. In terms of what goals students had for themselves, we asked them about what their desired scores were on the tests. It's pleasing to see that 76% wanted 100%. And 16% were happy with 80%, which is just a high distinction. And only a few students had lower ambitions. How hard were the tests? So how many attempts did they take to achieve their desired score? Most students said 2 to 3 times. The interesting bit is that we managed to get students to do something that they didn't have to do for their own benefit 2 to 3 times. I think that's a big win. And you did get some students that did go 4 or more times. How engaged were the students with the test? 33% say they revised their learning and retook the tests until they got 100%. When we came up with this approach and designed the system, this is what we had in mind. But this other 33% here says that they looked at the feedback given for all the possible answers. And this is some patterns that we've seen in the data. You'll see some students on their recent attempts will go from, say, 20%, increase to 60, increase to 100, and then you think they would stop at 100% because they've achieved 100%. But then you'll see that the graph goes down to 80, 40, or goes lower. It was a little bit puzzling, but it was actually something very positive. So what I think they were doing is after they've gotten 100%, they were exploring the test to see what the feedback was for the other incorrect items. So in terms of a learning pattern, I'd say that's like a genuine learner trying to not just get something correct, but understanding why other answer options are incorrect. So that was interesting to find in there. 20% of the students gamed the system, so they just trial and error until they worked out what the correct answer was. Not the best outcome, but probably better than if we didn't have the test and the students wouldn't be doing much. So at least they're interacting with it, at least they're sort of engaged to work out what the correct answer is. And 14% reattempted tests if they were unhappy with their scores. In terms of the usefulness for the test, 52% said it was somewhat useful and 48% very useful. Again, nobody said it wasn't useful, which I think is the big thing from these graphs. So they found the test to be useful. So in terms of the interviews, what came up, when you do the tests, it gives you the chance to reevaluate how you've done and what you've learned. So this is after completing some task. The tests were a quick and easy way to review what you hadn't learned. So this student is looking at it from the opposite perspective. So using the test to filter out what he hadn't learned, as opposed to using the test to find out what he did learn. The test helped me to reinforce my knowledge of the task, which is what we set up the test to be anyway. So in terms of their perspective on the test, 29% thought of them as a way to evaluate their learning, which is largely what the project was about, so that's a good outcome. 25% saw it as a study tool for exam revision. So if you recall to those graphs before, there were a lot of red dots around that revision period. So at least that assisted them for that. 24% saw it as an aid for understanding the course theory. And 20%, and this is interesting, saw it as a way to guide how I engage with the lecture slides, activities, and or readings. So when they got past that week 4, week 5, and they became very busy, instead of doing what we originally wanted them to do, which is do the task, do the test to work out what you've understood and go back and do the task, they did it the opposite way. They did the test to work out if they needed to do the task or not. So it's a little bit of time management and then prioritising what they need to do in this course in light of the other courses that they're undertaking. Somebody said he would do, so they saw the test as a revision tool. Somebody said that he would do every test all over again. We should check in the system to see if he's actually done it. So time management was a big issue that came up, or was a prominent issue that came up in the focus groups that we ran. So as part of the survey, we asked students if TTM helped them to manage their time. 52% said yes, 37% were unsure, and again, only 11% said no. So these guys here could still be convinced we could possibly improve the course, the system a little bit more. And I think this is one of the things that we need to catch up on as educators. Students say, I live a pretty busy lifestyle. And they do have a lot going Before TTM, I never really used to allocate my time that well, but on TTM it actually tells you roughly how long it's going to take to do the task. So having that duration on a task file actually helps students to prioritize and allocate their time. So those were the tasks and the tests. So in terms of the analytics features that we put in the system, did the students use them? 38% said a few times, 36% said occasionally, only 13% said no. How useful were they? 65% found them to be somewhat useful, 22% very useful, and 14% not very useful at all. So again, it's a very low amount of students that don't find them useful. What do they use the analytics features for? 34% used it to track their progress towards achieving a particular grade that they wanted. 29% used it to get a sense of how I was doing compared to the rest of the class, so a social comparison. 26% to see what I had forgotten to do or submit, so to help them keep track of their progress. And 9% didn't use the features, the analytics features. So in terms of using the analytics features for self-reflection, this is one of the key points of the projects, and I'm pleased that it came across to at least one of the students in the interview. And he said that to actually self-evaluate, you need something to go off of. And this is what we wanted with those visualizations of how they performed in the system. So it's not, and I suppose this is my general view on learning analytics. So the things that come out of it is not necessarily 100% correct or 100% right. They're an artifact that prompts a discussion. And in fact, this is what I did in some of my classes, where I'd have two tutors that I designated as one-on-one consultation sessions with students. And they came in, and because our students bring in their own laptops, I spoke to them one-on-one, got them to log into their own TTM account on their own laptop, click around to see what they've done, click around to see how they're performing against other students and so forth. And then I asked them, well, what do you think of it? Which I think is a better approach than me looking at what they're doing in the system and saying, well, you're not performing well enough. I think only the individual students can work out how well they're performing against their own goals and against external factors in their life that are affecting their studies. So on self-reflection, and other students use these to check whether the tests were completed or not, and whether he got 100% for everything, and that helped him to assess himself. So in terms of future work, there's quite a lot of data that we've collected in the system, and we need to sort of sit and analyse the data a bit more. These are only preliminary results. But there's always opportunities to improve some of the analytics features in the system that we have. What we have in there currently are fairly rudimentary, so it's not very advanced analytics, but looking at the positive results that we've gotten from the student focus group interviews and surveys, it seems to be very promising. And beyond that, this is more a learning analytics system. We can expand that to become an academic analytics system, so getting other non-learning performance data, so what courses students are enrolled in, their gender, how far they live from the university and so forth, and that gives us a bigger data set to play with. Might give us better ideas of behavioural patterns that aren't necessarily related just to learning performance. And I suppose one of the ultimate things is focusing on prescriptive learning analytics. Prescriptive analytics is where you've gotten data, you've done all the analysis, you've done the prediction, and then you can prescribe actions. So suggest prescribed actions to people to carry out. So with this, we might be able to say later on, for an individual student, getting his or her performance from the system and compare that to historical results. So we've been collecting data since semester 2004. So we can compile all of that data, compare an individual student and find the closest matching one. and then you can predict if you continue along these lines, this is what will happen. You'll pass, you'll fail, and so forth. If you don't want to pass and you want to get a higher mark, then historically these are what other students have done. They did this test by this date, or they learned this thing by that date, and that gives them a to-do list. If they follow that, it doesn't mean they will get those scores, but at least it gives them some general direction and guidance. And some acknowledgements, so all the students who participated, academics who were willing to trial it in their courses, and a whole bunch of research assistants. That's it.
Thanks, Chris. Does anybody have any questions for Chris?
Chris, can you talk about the whole teaching package as well? So what was the method of delivery? How did you match this with the actual teaching happening?
The system itself was fairly flexible. So apart from breaking down a course into weeks, into tasks and tests, there was nothing else really prescribed in it. And that turned out to be a benefit. In various courses, we integrated it to various degrees. I had a course that I had to redesign completely because it had to be on a different topic. So I took the opportunity to redesign that from the ground up to be TTM specific. So TTM provided the tutorial materials and the tests. From the Blackboard, I had a link that students could click to get onto TTM. The lectures were still on the Blackboard. All accessible stuff, assignments and official grades were on the Blackboard. So TTM was only for the tutorials. So designing that from the ground up, I could really sort of think about the task, make them small, bite-size, and think about how to make them testable so I could write the test for them. Writing the tests is a heavy undertaking because for each task you need to come up with 5 tests, so 5 multiple choice questions, 4 answer options. For each answer option you need to have a piece of feedback from that in the system. So it was heavy lifting, and in my course I typically have 3 to 5 tasks a week. So not all the tasks were testable, but I think probably 80% of it was. So that was, I suppose, a high integration with TTM. I had another course, where there was existing material, so I adapted that to use TTM. And it was the same way, so TTM was using the tutes and so forth. But because of the adaptation, it means that the tasks weren't as bite-sized, and they weren't necessarily as testable. So some of them had difficulties writing the test, some of them you couldn't write the test for. So we had a number of information systems courses like that. We had a course in social science where TTM was integrated at a very sort of light level because we weren't going to redo that course. So all it was here's the prescribed reading and here's the test that will check the knowledge of it. And students choose those in different ways. That course was interesting because it had a cohort of students that was face-to-face or blended learning, and a course that was a cohort that was only online. So it'd be interesting to sort of look at the usage patterns in the system and try to see if it was different. Answer your question? So in essence, it's fairly flexible, the system. You can use it in a variety of ways in your courses, so it's not sort of strongly prescribed. And that was a positive because we always thought the students would do the task and then do the test. And they started doing that, and by about week 5 when they became familiar with the system, they did the complete opposite, which was the test and then the task. So there's a lot of benefit, I think, into adding that flexibility in the system to see how students want to use it, as opposed to me thinking, well, this is the best way for you to use it.
Any other questions?
I'm just thinking from an academic integrity point of view. So, how, if I wanted to check things like academic integrity within what this assessment task and what students are actually doing, is there scope for that?
I think so. I mean, you could use the checkpoint analytics, so to work out what the students have been doing. One of the key points is we didn't use it for assessment. because we wanted them to engage in a learning activity. But I suppose one thing you could do is, if a student gets, I mean, it's difficult, because let's say you get a student that gets a very high mark, and you have suspicions about that, you can check to see what the student's been doing in the system. So if the student's been very engaged, doing a lot of work, and you can get that from the data in the system, then you're less suspicious. But if the student hasn't been doing a whole lot, that doesn't really tell you anything, because he could have been learning from other resources online and so forth. So it's not clear cut. It gives you an indication, but it's not sort of the be all and end all.
Chris, I have the opposite.
Yeah.
So I've used TTM in my course, and I recently had a student who's trying to appeal her final grade. She hasn't passed. And she was a late enrollment, and she was never going to pass. But now she's like, I've worked so hard, I've put everything into this course. She logged into TTM once and hasn't done anything since. You know, and I was like, well, actually the data demonstrates that you haven't used it, it's been a useful tool, it's there, and I haven't heard back from her since.
Yeah, so I think that's a good example, and I think of that along the lines of student accountability. So from that example, you can, I mean, you don't know what the student has or hasn't learned, but you can clearly say that the student hasn't been engaged with the process and the resources that you've put into place for the course. And I think, unfortunately, we start heading towards that a bit more and more. So students sort of engage less, but I seem to feel that there seems to be more complaints about their marks and their performance and their progress. So that's a really...
That's a really nice example. We do have student engagement and the amount of learning that actually has resulted, but also the assessment task, whether it actually reflects what's in the content.
I think if you're trying to work out how much learning has occurred, that's always the difficult part. I mean, how do we typically do it in education? You give them a test, you give them an assessment, you get a number that's sort of like a proxy for how much they've learned. How representative that number is hard to say. So if you're trying to work out, you know, if they've learnt enough to get that mark on this assignment, it becomes difficult. But if you're trying to work out if they've engaged with the system enough for them to pass or get a decent mark, you can get some indication of that.
Andrew,
I just have a question. I guess it relates to overall performance. So you said that one of the courses was a complete redesign. But for the ones that you delivered before, did you see a difference in how students performed? Did students mention differences that they've done better in this course than they would have done in others?
No, I don't think there was a clear difference. Was it?
I'm waiting, can't wait for the results, so I've just tried it this semester. But I've seen the grades of my online students for the first time ever has passed my face-to-face students. And the reason I wanted TTM was because with the online students, they do work in bursts, it's the nature of it, but their overall grades were always lower than the face-to-face students. And I teach a course in research design, where it's each week, you can't just drop into week 8 without having done the earlier weeks. So I was like, well, and often they didn't realise that they weren't understanding the key concepts until they failed the final assignment because they thought they knew or they hadn't done the reading. So putting the TTM in on the, testing their comprehension of readings each week was getting them to figure out if they knew it or not. And this semester was the first time ever that they've had an overall higher grade than my face-to-face students. And I would expect that they've used it more too because it was part of their online platform. They just thought it was part of their weekly.
Yeah, I don't know. It was a good example. I mean, typically I don't judge, I guess, how good something is based on the changes in student grades because you have a lot of external factors. But yeah, I think that's a good example. But also, I guess in that course, TTM was integrated at a very sort of light level, not as deeply in our own courses. Justin ran the focus groups and interviews because I couldn't interview my own students for ethical issues. Was there anything that came up?
I was going to say, I'm not sure if it was an interview or a survey. There was a question: would you like to see TTM used in other courses. So ones that we hadn't considered anything, and I'm pretty sure it was a very high number said yes. And even in some of the comments in the interviews and focus groups were that this was a great system, I'd love to have had it in some of the other ones. So we can't directly know if it would have been helpful for them, but at least in the students' mind, they were like, yeah, this system would really apply for me, they would have helped me manage it better. So yeah, we did see that sort of pattern, I think, yeah.
Do you think that by implementing something like this, we would get more students thinking about their main concepts in the course or in the program?
I think so. And I don't think that's necessarily a result of the system. I mean, the system facilitates all of that. But I think the trick to that comes down to what questions you have in the test. Because I think from one of the interviewees, they were saying that, yes, they did the reading or they did the task, but by doing the test and looking at the questions that was asked, they could work out what the lecturer valued in terms of what the lecturer wanted them to take away from that task. So if you construct the test in that way, I think that's useful.
Okay, so we need to
prompt that a little bit.
Yeah. So then we need to be thinking about alignment of our learning outcomes.
Yeah, so like any sort of course design, I mean, the system is there to sort of facilitate it and engage students a little bit more, and it's a little bit different. I mean, the way I see this, it's sort of like, I guess when I was in high school, you used to have, read this chapter in a book, and then at the end of the chapter there'll be these questions, and then you can check the answers at the back of the book. Well, that's the thing with this, right? They chose to do the questions and then read the chapter, but I guess the concept is the same. It's just sort of the new age version of it, the digitized version of it, and you've broken it up into smaller chunks. Because I know clearly, if I go to my students, read chapter 4 for next week, nobody's going to read it. And in a way, it's right, because it can be fairly dry and fairly boring. So at least this provides them with some interaction. So the ones that choose to sort of read it and then do the test, good. The ones that weren't going to read the chapter but just decided to play with the test to work out what the answers are, at least it's something. Yeah.
So one thing that we are very keen in our teaching is that the student engagement. Did you see that a correlation between the engagement and the end results?
We haven't looked at that, but I think by a couple of weeks, students knew. I mean, they turn up to class, they engage with the material. I think.
But it would be interesting to measure the engagement. Have an indicator of that engagement and the end result, which is the mark that they get at the end, or how well they've done the exam or something.
Yes, except I didn't have ethics approval to get their grades. I don't know. Like I said, I don't see the grade as the be-all and end-all. I mean, as a student, I'm in a class, I could get a high distinction, but I have some external factors that stops me from doing it. But all things considered, if I've engaged well, I've gotten a good experience, I feel I've learnt, I think that's a win. You don't necessarily, as a student, I always wanted to get a high distinction, but you don't necessarily need that. And a lot of students feel that way. If you look at the way students strategize over assignments and the different weightings, they sort of calculate it, I just need to pass this, and then I'll be okay. So as long as I don't fail this, I'm okay. It's not, I need to get this mark on this assignment so I can get a high distinction. So whether that's right or wrong, I don't know, but I suppose this is what I've observed. And it's the same thing as me showing them the artifacts and going, what do you think? Right? To get their own opinion, as opposed to me saying, this is what you got, you should be doing this, this and that. It's for them to judge. I mean, at this point, they're adults, you want them to be self-directed learners when they finish. So me impressing my opinions on what they should be doing doesn't necessarily sort of help that for me.
Andrew?
How can other people get access to this?
You have to send me an email.
Okay.
Yeah, so on the student aspect, it's fairly good, so the students can use it in all the way. So for other students to get, for other people to get access to it, Kat will tell you it's this intricate. Well, it's not that hard. They're just putting your data in some Excel sheets.
I'm a social science lecturer and can figure it out. You guys will be fine.
So yeah, so you just fill out these spreadsheets, and we run some scripts over them and it uploads it into the system. So eventually we need to look at, well, if that's another discussion, but it would be nice if there was some administrative console where people could sort of set them up themselves. But, and we sort of consulted with Kat a little bit to give us some ideas about how she could integrate it with the course and all of that. So it's not just sort of like a blackboard thing where it's there and then you work it out.
Do you cancel their account, or they can keep their account forever?
On TTM?
Yeah.
What did you do first?
I start fresh every semester.
Yeah. So it starts fresh every semester.
Okay. So if I've done a course last semester, I can't go back and see the content.
It is possible, depending on the resources. I mean, we can
So
we kept it simple at the beginning,
Yeah.
at the moment, so it's just semester by semester. But all the data there can be extracted anytime.
I think in general, because we sort of built it ourselves, we can do pretty much whatever.
Yeah.
One of the nice things that we did was, and this worked out well with ethics, because I guess with ethics, because we're in the courses, we're not supposed to know which of our students participate or don't participate. So we built this thing in the system where at a certain time they'll get a prompt, ask them, do you want to donate your data? If they go yes, it's donated anonymously. So all their details are sort of hashed or stripped out, and we don't know. And normally without a system, you'd need a third party. Like with the interviews and focus group, we have to get Justin to do it. But through the system, you can do that. So in general, we can do pretty much whatever with the system. Constraints of resources. I've always had a bit of an issue with these type of systems. So we spend a lot of time in the universities to spend a lot of resources doing it. What happens with the system now that we finish with our research projects? So because our courses are built on that, we're going to keep on using it. But if other people want to use it, then it becomes a different. If a lot of other people want to use it, then it becomes something else entirely. I sort of feel it should be supported by ITS. So supported not just technologically, but getting people to understand how to use it, how to design their courses around it, and so forth. So it becomes a different kind of beast.
Any other questions? No? Well, thank you very much, Chris. That was very interesting and insightful. So thanks for